I never thought an ordinary school day could alter the course of my life. It was supposed to be predictable, just another monotonous afternoon spent scribbling notes, enduring the ticking clock, and waiting for the final bell to release me from my academic prison. But that day was different. That day, something happened that would remain etched in my memory forever. It started subtly, like the first ripples of a coming storm. A glance held a second too long. A voice softer than usual, carrying an undertone I couldn't quite place. The realization that I was alone in the classroom with him. Mr. Calloway, or just Ethan as I would come to know him later, was the type of teacher students admired. Charismatic, intelligent, effortlessly in control without ever raising his voice. He was in his late 30s, with dark hair that bore the faintest traces of silver at the edges. That maturity lent him an air of distinction, a presence that commanded attention. I had always admired him, perhaps more than I should have, but never had I thought much of it. At least, not until that evening. The classroom was nearly empty, the last echoes of hurried footsteps fading down the hallways as students rushed home. I remained behind, as I often did, carefully scribbling answers onto my assignment. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden desks. The golden hue gave the room a dreamlike quality, as though time had slowed, trapping me in this silent, unmoving space. I liked the quiet, at least, I used to. But today it felt different. He was still here, and I could feel it. I shifted in my seat, gripping my pen a little tighter. Across the room, Mr. Calloway sat at his desk, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms. His tie was slightly loosened, his posture relaxed, but his focus was elsewhere. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I pretended not to notice. I told myself I was imagining it. But the sensation didn't fade. The air seemed heavier, thick with something unspoken. I glanced up, hesitant, only to find him already looking at me. "You're still here," he said, voice low, smooth, carrying across the empty room. I swallowed. "Yeah, just finishing this assignment." He leaned back slightly, tilting his head, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "You always stay late." I forced a small laugh. "Guess I just work better without distractions." His lips curved slightly, but he didn't reply. The silence between us stretched, the ticking of the classroom clock the only sound filling the space. I turned my gaze back to my notebook, though I couldn't process a single word on the page. "You don't have to rush," he murmured. "It's just you and me here." Those words settled over me, warm and heavy. Just you and me. I shouldn't have noticed. I shouldn't have felt anything. But I did. My breath felt shallow, my hands suddenly too stiff around my pen. I nodded absent-mindedly, forcing myself to focus on the paper in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. He stood up then, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound made me flinch. His footsteps were unhurried as he walked toward me, the room shrinking with each step. When he stopped beside my desk, his presence felt overwhelming. I could smell his cologne now, subtle, clean, familiar. I kept my head down, staring at the inked words in front of me, as if they held some kind of answer. "You've seemed distracted lately," he observed. My fingers tightened around my pen. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I had been distracted. But not by school. By moments like this. He waited, but when I didn't speak, he let out a quiet chuckle. "It's all right," he said. "We all get a little lost in thought sometimes." Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his hand brushed against my arm. It was fleeting, light, barely a touch at all. But it might as well have been a lightning bolt. My breath hitched, my body tensed. He withdrew almost immediately, as if he hadn't noticed what he'd done. But I had. The ghost of his touch lingered, burning against my skin. "I'm always here if you need anything," he said, his voice quieter now. I finally looked up at him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark in the dimming light. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge whatever had just passed between us, but I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded, a small, meaningless gesture. But inside, my mind was a storm, churning with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What just happened? And why did part of me want it to happen again? Those words sent a jolt through me. Just you and me. The realization of how alone we truly were in that moment sank in, making the walls around us seem to shrink, drawing us into a space where reality blurred. I swallowed hard. Right, I said, barely above a whisper. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. You've seemed a little distracted lately, he said, his voice laced with something unreadable. I've noticed. I wanted to deny it, to explain it away, but I couldn't find the words. How could I? How could I explain the thoughts that had begun creeping into my mind, thoughts I hadn't even admitted to myself? My voice failed me, my face heating up. He smiled then, a soft, knowing smile. It's okay, he murmured. We all get distracted sometimes. His hand reached out, resting gently on my arm. The touch was light, innocent, almost. But there was something beneath it. An electric current that sent a shiver up my spine. My breath caught in my throat. Then, just as suddenly, he withdrew his hand, leaving behind an absence that felt far too heavy. I'm always here if you need to talk, he said. I nodded, unable to form a coherent response. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding against my ribs. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. And yet, some part of me didn't want to pull back. The sudden rumble of thunder broke the fragile silence, a deep, ominous sound that vibrated through the walls. The air grew heavy, and I felt the weight of the storm outside pressing against the windows. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, anything, an intense flash of lightning split the sky. The sudden burst of light illuminated the room, and for a moment, everything stood still. The brilliant flash seemed to last forever, and I was paralyzed by the intensity of it. In that split second, I jumped. The shock of the light and the loud crack of thunder taking me completely by surprise. My heart pounded as if I had just been caught off guard by something far worse. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I instinctively reached out for him. The force of the storm outside seemed to surge within me, and my body, suddenly overwhelmed, pressed against him in search of some kind of comfort. He caught me easily, his arms wrapping around me as the sound of the storm raged on. The thunder boomed again, louder this time. And I felt his warmth enveloping me, grounding me in the chaos of the moment. It's okay, he whispered again, his voice calm and steady in contrast to the storm around us. I've got you. I didn't know if I was seeking his protection or if I was just reacting to the fear that the storm had awakened in me, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the feeling of his arms around me, steady and unwavering. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the rain now pouring in sheets against the windows. But inside, in that brief moment, it was as if everything else had faded away. It was just the two of us, caught in the storm of both nature and emotion. When the storm's roar seemed to die down, I slowly pulled back, realizing that I had been holding onto him more tightly than I realized. My face flushed again, but I didn't know if it was from the lingering warmth of his touch or the rush of emotions I couldn't place. He looked at me with a quiet, understanding gaze, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from my face. Are you all right? He asked, his tone soft but filled with a certain weight that made my heart skip a beat. I nodded, though the words stuck in my throat. I didn't feel like I was completely all right. There were so many things I needed to say, things I couldn't put into words just yet. The air between us felt charged, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. But for now, all I could do was hold on to the moment, to the safety and the chaos that existed simultaneously. His hands, which had been resting lightly against my back, moved, one trailing up slightly, his fingers brushing against the curve of my shoulder. The touch sent electricity through me, and I knew he felt it too because his jaw tightened, his breathing just a fraction uneven. Tell me to let go, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have. I knew I should have. But I didn't. The storm outside roared, another flash of lightning illuminating the room, casting shadows across his face. The tension between us crackled like the energy in the air, poised at the brink of something irreversible. And then, slowly, carefully, as if testing the weight of what was happening, he let his fingers trace the length of my arm before pulling away, his hands dropping to his sides as if forcing himself to retreat. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally escaped me. The space between us still felt charged, as though the storm had left something behind in its wake. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for certain. After this moment, there was no going back. The air between us had changed. The storm outside had passed, but the one brewing between us was only growing stronger. It was no longer about the words we exchanged or the glances that lingered a second too long. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. The days after that night blurred together in a haze of stolen moments and whispered tension. Every interaction felt like a delicate balance between restraint and inevitability. In the classroom, when surrounded by others, we pretended nothing had changed. But it had. I felt it in every moment he stood too close, in every accidental touch that lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. One afternoon, I stayed after class again, unable to resist the invisible force drawing me back. I told myself it was for schoolwork, but we both knew better. He was at his desk when I entered, glancing up as if expecting me. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. I hesitated near the door, suddenly unsure if I should have come. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I saw the flicker of something unreadable pass through them. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, as if inviting me in without saying a word. Still struggling with that assignment? His voice was calm, controlled, yet there was an underlying edge to it. I nodded, walking to my usual seat. Something like that. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. I pulled out my notebook, but my hands felt unsteady. The words on the page blurred together as my thoughts scattered in every direction except the one they should have been focused on. I didn't have to look up to know he was watching me. I could feel it, an unshakable presence, as though he were studying every movement, every breath. And then, just when I thought I might be able to push through the silence, he spoke again. "You've been different lately." I swallowed hard. Different how? He didn't answer right away. Instead, I heard the faint sound of a chair scraping against the floor, and then he was closer. My breath caught as he stood beside my desk, one hand resting lightly on the wooden surface. "I see it in the way you look at me," he said softly. "And in the way you don't." I turned toward him. But before I could form a response, he reached down, fingers just barely grazing the edge of my notebook. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver through me. The unspoken words between us weighed heavier than ever. "This," he murmured, "whatever it is, it's dangerous." I knew he was right. Every rational part of me screamed that this should stop. That I should stand up, walk out of the room, and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. Instead, I did something reckless. "I don't care," I whispered, my voice barely audible but firm. His gaze darkened, his fingers tightening slightly against the desk. I could see the internal battle waging in his eyes, the silent war between what was right and what we both wanted. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I reached out, my fingertips grazing his hand. It was the lightest touch. Yet it felt like setting off a chain reaction, a spark igniting something far more dangerous. The space between us evaporated. He exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for the briefest second as if to steady himself. When he opened them again, I knew we had crossed a line that neither of us could pretend didn't exist anymore. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice raw, his breathing uneven. I didn't. His hand moved, slowly, deliberately, tracing up my arm, sending fire in its wake. I tilted my head slightly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air felt charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. And then, he kissed me. It was hesitant at first, as if testing the weight of this moment. But the hesitation didn't last. The dam broke, and suddenly, every suppressed thought, every lingering glance, every silent yearning we had ignored came crashing down at once. His hands framed my face, his touch both careful and desperate. I melted into him, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as I clung to the reality of what was happening. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think, but my body refused to listen. The kiss deepened, a tangled mix of desire and restraint. He pulled me closer, and for the first time, I let myself stop thinking. I let myself feel. Time ceased to exist. There was no classroom, no consequences, just him, just this moment. And I never wanted it to end, but it did. His breath was uneven, his forehead still pressed against mine, the ghost of his lips lingering on my skin. His hands were on my waist, but his grip was hesitant, as if fighting the battle between right and wrong. He exhaled deeply, his voice rough with restraint. We can't. I felt the tension radiating from him. The way his fingers tightened ever so slightly before releasing, as if he was about to let go. My stomach dropped, expecting rejection, expecting him to step away. A bitter disappointment started creeping in. But then, something changed. His fingers twitched against my skin, and before I could process it, he pulled me back, hard. His lips crashed into mine again. But this time, there was no hesitation. No restraint. A raw, unfiltered need overtook every rational thought. The last remnants of control dissolved as his hands gripped my hips, pressing me flesh against him. I gasped against his mouth, but he didn't slow down. If anything, he deepened the kiss, consuming me entirely. His hands roamed, exploring every inch of me as if memorizing the way my body felt beneath his touch. There was no more distance, no more careful restraint. Only heat, only reckless abandon. His jacket was the first to hit the floor, then his tie, his shirt, each piece discarded without a second thought. My own clothing followed suit, leaving nothing between us but feverish desire and the inevitability of this moment. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no school, no rules, just us, tangled in something we could never undo. His name slipped from my lips, a breathless whisper swallowed by the intensity of his kiss. The sound of it seemed to unravel him further, his hands gripping me tighter, his body pressing me deeper into the desk as if trying to erase the space between us completely. It was too much. It wasn't enough. The room was filled with the sounds of us heavy breathing. Whispered pleas, the quiet desperation of two people who had finally let go of everything holding them back. Every stolen touch, every unspoken word had led to this, and now there was no stopping. No turning back. The days that followed blurred into a series of stolen moments and secret encounters. We were reckless. We were insatiable. It started with lingering touches in the classroom when no one was looking, his fingers brushing against mine when he handed back a paper, his hand pressing against the small of my back as I walked past. Then it escalated. An empty supply closet, the back corner of the library, the deserted hallway after hours, each time more dangerous, more exhilarating. We found new places to meet, spaces where we could let go of every inhibition without fear of interruption. In his office after the last bell rang. Against the bookshelves in the archive room, behind the drawn curtains of the auditorium, each encounter more intense than the last, each moment feeding the fire that refused to be extinguished. The thrill of secrecy only fueled our hunger. We couldn't stop. We didn't want to. Every touch, every whispered name in the darkness of the locked classroom only cemented the truth we both refused to acknowledge. We were too far gone. The boundaries had disappeared entirely, replaced only by the raw, undeniable need for each other. But secrets never stay hidden forever. People started to notice the subtle signs that something was unfolding between us. It began with the way I lingered after class, pretending to organize my notes or adjust my bag just to steal a few extra moments with him. Then there was the way his eyes seemed to follow me, lingering a little too long, betraying something deeper than a teacher's professional interest. At first, the whispers among classmates were faint, almost imperceptible. But they grew louder over time. What started as quiet speculation turned into murmurs, and those murmurs eventually hardened into pointed accusations. The tension in the air became palpable. Every glance, every word exchanged, seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. I could feel the eyes of others on us, watching, wondering, judging. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in. And I could no longer deny that we had crossed a line that was now visible to everyone around us. Then, one day, the fragile balance we'd been clinging to shattered completely. It happened after school, the corridors quiet and empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. He was waiting for me, his face pale, his features drawn, as though he hadn't slept in days. The moment I saw him, I knew something was terribly wrong. His usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded anxiety that sent a chill through me. "They know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if saying it any louder would make it real. My heart raced, and panic clawed at my chest, making it hard to breathe. "What? Who?" I stammered, my voice trembling as I struggled to process his words. "The administration," he said, his tone heavy with dread. "Someone reported us." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath me. My legs felt unsteady, and I grasped the edge of a nearby locker for support. This was the end of everything. The secret we'd tried so hard to keep, the connection we'd nurtured in stolen moments, was no longer ours to protect. The reality of what this meant crashed over me in waves, the rumors, the judgment, the consequences. I wanted to say something, to ask who could have done this or how it had happened, but the words caught in my throat. There was no point in questioning it now. The damage was done. All that was left was the fallout, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The fallout was swift and merciless. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers became accusations, and soon, the entire school was buzzing with speculation. Teachers looked at me differently. Students whispered behind my back, their eyes filled with curiosity, judgment, and something worse, pity. But none of it compared to what happened to him. He was gone. Just like that. One day, he was standing in front of the classroom, his voice steady, his presence commanding. The next, his desk was empty, his name removed from the staff directory. There were no goodbyes, no explanations. Just silence. I tried to reach him, but every call went unanswered. Every text was left unread. It was as if he had vanished completely. Erased from my world, as if he had never been there in the first place. I should have known it would end this way. There was never a future for us. What we had was built on borrowed time, on stolen moments that were never meant to last. And yet, knowing that didn't make it any easier. It didn't stop the ache in my chest every time I passed by the classroom where we had once stood too close, whispered too many dangerous things. Weeks passed. The scandal lost its heat, replaced by new gossip, new distractions. People moved on. But I didn't. I couldn't. Then, one evening, long after I had given up hope of ever hearing from him again, a single message appeared on my phone. "I'm sorry." 2 words. That was all. But they shattered me. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. I had 1,000 things I wanted to ask, 1,000,000 things I wanted to say. But in the end, I typed only one. "Why?" This time, he answered. "Because I had to." The conversation ended there. He didn't offer anything more, and I didn't push. Maybe there was nothing left to say. Maybe he had already let go, even if I couldn't. I still think about him. About what we were, about what we lost. Some nights, I dream of him, his touch, his voice, the way he made me feel like I was the only thing that mattered. And then I wake up and reality crashes back down on me. The past is a ghost that never truly leaves. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always find a way to haunt us. But now, as I stand here, staring at the empty space where he once belonged, a single thought lingers in my mind. What am I supposed to do now?